Let's call this meeting of the Assembly Ethics and Election Committee to order. We'll start with identification.
Dick Training Assembly.
Mr. Chair, before you start,
And we need to project because we have, the recorder is clear over here. It's a big room. There's other things going on. So speak loudly. Your outside voice today.
Gretchen Wemhoff, Assembly.
Austin Quinn Davidson. Amy Solberg.
Barbara Jones.
Bill Paulson.
Forrest Dunbar.
Dean Gates, Assembly Johnson.
Dennis Wheeler, Resource Data.
And I'm Pete Peterson, Chair. Let's go to new business and we'll talk about our new secure Dropbox location at the Begich Middle School. Is this something Amy wants to talk about?
So, Amy Solberg, Chair. We have a new location. We had ordered 4 new boxes, and we had a location for only 3 of them. And so we had a request for something in Muldoon area, so we contacted ASD and we got in Begich Middle School.
All right.
Oh, and the 4 new boxes are in the back. They don't have any stickers on them yet. They are upside down. We're going to get the concrete bases done sometime this week, early next week, and then all of the boxes will be deployed and placed the end of next week.
Fantastic. Mr. Dunbar.
Amy, we at our last community council meeting I went to, or I guess you were in Juneau, but I received a question that we've gotten a few times, which is there a way to make the boxes a little more visible? That particularly in Bartlett, people have a hard time seeing because they're white and they blend into the snow in the background. And I see these are white boxes again, but just wanted to know if there's anything to do it.
Yes, so through the chair, there's a couple things that we've done. So for direction, we've got these arrows. And so for Bartlett, once we put arrows out to kind of direct people where to go, that was a lot easier for them to find the box. And then also, Anna Campione, she got us some flags, and they're called feather flags. So they're about that tall and about that wide, and they just kind of feather in the wind. They're a bright yellowish gold color, so they're going to stand out.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One other thing that we should mention is that the MOA has developed resources online, so you can dial into those locations online and see exactly where they are located on property.
So there's like a GIS map or something?
Through the chair, yes, that is correct. There's a GIS map, and it has all the locations, and then you can pinpoint not only the drop boxes, but all of the accessible book centers, or ABCs.
And that's available at the muni.org website or the elections website or both? Or
Correct, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Dick.
Robert, or Amy, do those temporary signs, the whirligigs, violate our sign ordinance? Because they're temporary signs, you can't have temporary signs. So do we have an exemption we've given ourselves?
I don't know the answer to that question.
It sounds like we need to talk
Barbara,
to an
take a look
attorney.
at it. You know what I'm talking about.
It's a good thing we don't have any attorneys in the room. No, we'll just have to check on that, and thanks for thinking about that, Dick.
Well, if we don't, somebody else is going to bring it up, believe me.
Probably will happen. All right, any other discussion about the new Dropbox location at Begich Middle School? All right, fantastic. Let's move on to new business B, the concept of omnibus AO to reconcile service area boundaries.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, for putting this topic on your agenda. In the last month, we have been working, we have a database from our ballot designer, and that's Dominion is the vendor that does that. And that database that they create that ballot, of course, I'm going to use downtown because that's going to be a good example. It has a downtown race on that ballot. So how does that ballot just get attributed to voters downtown? So we have a database, and it has what they call districts, and they are assembly districts. And then we assign a ballot style to the precincts downtown. And so it's a fairly elaborate database. I mean, Assembly, there's only 6, and if we only had 6 districts, we might not be having this conversation with you. But I'm afraid to, do you know how many we have, Dennis, altogether?
The service areas,
Service areas plus,
rural road service areas and so on. I don't, but it's a lot.
it's a lot. So there's a lot of splits. I think the database, the GIS database had over 150 lines. So there's 150 combinations for all of these service areas. So one of the challenges that I've had this year is reconciling this database that we've created with our ballot designer with the database that the GIS department has created with our tax districts. And so I wanted to just point out some of the challenges. And Mr. Wheeler has suffered through this with me. In fact, 2 weeks ago when I had to go to the assembly meeting, he stayed and worked late. And if you look back here on this map, there were 23 sticky notes that where Mr. Wheeler identified discrepancies between our design, our ballot design, and the GIS database. So these are issues that ultimately we need to take care of. And there are 3 types of issues. And so the first issue is really fairly simple. It's where the fire service area boundary and the park service area boundary don't match, or ARDSA. And so if you just look up on the map, ARDSA is the blue. And so if you see that just running around the inlet there's ARDSA, parks, and fire. But if you get up close, they don't match. They're somehow when those service areas were created, the legal descriptions were probably different. And Dennis has some maps he's going to explain to you. I just want to tell you the problem from a layperson's perspective. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dennis and Bill, which is why I invited Bill here. So that's one problem where we have our own service areas don't have the same boundaries in a place like along the inlet where they really should. But then we have some more complicated situations where I'm just guessing where the service area boundary is the ridge on top of the mountain somewhere or along a creek. And what we've discovered is our boundary is here, and the precinct line follows that same pattern, but they're different. So those are a little bit more complicated. And again, I'm just telling you that this is a challenge, and I'm asking you to allow us to have further exploration to solve this. And there's one other type of challenge where it's sort of like I call it the vacuum cleaner. We have a vacuum cleaner precinct, and our records show that the fire and parks go like this and just cut the vacuum cleaner in half. But GIS records show that the fire and parks go around the vacuum cleaner. It's just inconsistent. And so those are the 3 types of problems that I've identified. And so, Mr. Chair, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Wheeler, and he can explain to you, probably in more technical language than I did, what these actual problems are, and he can refer to the diagrams here.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. And, this is a problem we have discussed and been aware of for a while, and it puts us in a situation where we have to print numerous different ballot styles. In some instances, there may be only, a dozen people or fewer that get a specific ballot style. And so we're trying to figure out a way to sort of merge some of these if we possibly can, and maybe Mr. Wheeler will give us an idea how we can go about doing that. Dennis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I think Barbara covered that really, really well. systematically for the elections, you need to have every physical aspect of the municipality assign the ballot style, or you should, so that you can be prepared to provide any individual that may claim that area as their residence location will have a ballot available to them with the right races. Otherwise, you end up giving people either, like, for example, an area-wide ballot, where they're only getting to vote area-wide races, so they miss out on the opportunity to vote their local races or their service area races. Or you give them, they end up getting simply the wrong ballot. They're voting on races they're not qualified to vote on, right, because of their residency doesn't match up. So we do everything we can in this process to certainly avoid the second possibility and minimize the first possibility, so that as much as possible people are getting to vote all the races for which they should be able to vote. This document here is just a representative example of some of what's up on that map, indicating some of the problem areas. The upper one on the first page is similar to what Barbara described as inconsistencies in how people interpret what is, for example, a creek boundary. So there's the North Fork of Campbell Creek, and the boundaries used meander along the creek line, but not every entity uses that same method of describing that boundary. Is it a certain distance off center line? How is that tracked? Who draws that? And so you get these weird little patches where you have what may be section line boundaries that are inconsistent. That's the vertical line. And then the horizontal line is one entity is using the meandering of the creek, the other is using what appears to be a section line description. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 different holes in that one intersection. So now you're adding 4 new ballot styles because there are 4 potential areas where the ballot would be different because of where the service areas and the precinct boundaries crisscross each other. So,
and this is really important, as Mr. Peterson said, it's more expensive for us to have those separate ballot styles. But I would argue the biggest problem is that there could be one voter there. And we do have circumstances where we do have ballot styles with one voter. Wow. And the problem is the votes are recorded by ballot style. You could identify how that voter voted. We don't provide that information to the public, but it is public information. We try not to report it that way. But you can see, as Dennis said, on this example alone, you could have multiple voters that have a single ballot style and their vote could be identified.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Barbara, can you walk us through an example? I'm having a hard time picturing, where would that one person live on this map?
This is not that particular example, but it's really close to that kind of scenario. If you look at the second drawing, and if you look at the top where you have dotted red lines that intersect in a sideways T, and then you've got what I think is a green or blue line, below the horizontal red dashed line, you can see some residential properties that have that meandering line cut through those properties. That person in that corner, depending on how that point is located, could receive a different ballot style than everybody else in the neighborhood, without that being really what should happen. Right? Because if that meandering line...
What is in between the green and the red dotted that's different? Wouldn't they just all get... Because the red...
Right. So in this example, if you were to assume that the right-hand side, all of the colored out pink area, is part of an Eagle River precinct, because some of those Eagle River precincts are really deep, that run up down into Chugach Park, right, along that way. That's somebody who should be voting, for example, Eagle River Parks and Service area. But really, they're part and parcel of what would be Anchorage Parks and Service area, potentially. That's
people between the green and the red.
Correct. You could have one house that's captured in that spot where theoretically they should be Anchorage Parks, but by physical location, because of the way the boundaries are drawn, they're falling into Eagle River.
And so the green boundary is what? That's our boundary? Or what boundary is that on the map?
In this particular example, I have to go back up into the wall and double check.
Green is usually parks, is that right?
I think so.
Yeah. Yellow is fire, green is parks.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. That's helpful.
Mr. Trainee?
Dennis, we also had the problem because part of the hillside parks did not come in on unification. So we've got some parts of Anchorage that just didn't come in. They get to use the parks, but they don't have to pay for it. And you were talking about Camel Creek.
Yeah.
That road, that creek used to meander. The developers came in and straight lined it. It meanders nowhere. It's all straight now. So hopefully they redid the lines to show a straight line. Thanks.
Mr. Falsey?
Just for additional background, for folks who don't really know the deep history of this service area, shenanigans, want some additional orientation. We took a look at the title that governs service areas in 2016. We cleaned it up a lot, but the deep origin is the Anchorage Charter says we can have special services in service areas. If you want to do that, mostly you send them to the voters, you put a polygon on the map so you want to opt in. When we unified, we picked up a whole lot of the pre-existing service areas that were either the city boundary service, city which was the city became a service area, or were already in the borough codes. And some of those had legal descriptions. A lot of them did not. They were a marker drawn on a Biscayne map somewhere. And then that got Xeroxed into our code and carried forward. So there's a hard way to solve this problem, and then there's simpler ways of solving this problem. Some of this may just be GIS looked at a bad photocopy of an old borough of Anchorage service area line on a map and said, I think it goes here. But that's not controlling, that's just an interpretation of this terrible artifact that we have to work with. And so some of them, we might look at the original maps and go, GIS drew this line wrong. Let's draw all three of those lines the same. And then it just gets cleaned up. There's no ordinance, there's no nothing. We just fix it. That's an internal. Let's chat about it with Tina Miller and we might make some progress. Some of them...
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt. That's why I invited him. I love that, solving the problem. Thank you very much, Bill.
Some of them were administratively merged, so threads got pulled out of certain service areas and sort of arbitrarily recombined with other service areas. There may be some instances where the assembly can pass an ordinance that literally moves some things as long as they're in they're offering the special service at the same level to reconcile. But if the ultimate answer is that some of these boundaries just really, really are different, that ends up taking a vote of the people as often as not, and that's tough. And the very hard thing is the service areas have nothing to do with the Department of Elections voter precincts. So when we just said the hillside does this or the Anchorage Bowl does this, there's no reason at all, and in practice there isn't any reason to think that the service area boundaries will ever map squarely on the precincts. So long as we have somebody else drawing election boundaries and historical places that have opted in services, there are irrevocably going to be a whole lot of ballot styles. We have, after the cleanup in 2016, 66 service area maps that we've codified. In practice, a lot of them have been administratively merged into the streetlight service area in Eagle River, so I think we have something like 39 active, really different service area maps, although I'll confess to you, there are some service areas we're not even sure why they continue to have independent existence. There's the Old City service area, the Spenard service area still exists. I don't know why Spenard has an independent existence, and it is almost impossible to figure out because the 1975 ordinances said the Spenard service area has all the powers it used to have in the borough, except for fire, which we're taking out, except for police, which we're taking out, except for parks, which we're taking out, and what's left? We gotta dig through the 8 years of borough action on Spenard service area to figure out what other powers it had. In any event, it's a complicated mess, but we're happy to help clean it up.
Mr. Trainee, and then
Also, for an area to be brought into the service area, the area we've got, they have to agree to come in. We have to agree to take them in. Con Bendit, we can thank him for that piece of fabulous legislation. So as we're doing this, we have to make sure we're not dragging some area into here that didn't originally sign up to be part of that service area. Otherwise, we got a court suit in our hands.
Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I think like the Spenard service area, I assume it doesn't require any kind of different ballot stuff. There's not an election now. Right.
I know it's a different tax district. We call it a different tax district.
does it impact our ballot style?
So it's probably a fourth problem that I haven't mentioned to you. So in our database that I was mentioning, our database goes like this. It starts with Rabbit Creek, number 1, precinct 105, and it's in parks, in fire, in police. So that's the way we describe that on our database. The GIS database is called Spanard. So that is one of the additional problems that we have. And we just but that one's another easy one that I think we can do an internal fix. We just need to work with GIS to add an additional field in their properties to match our names.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. So I think that's interesting, and that's not the thrust I was going for.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's totally fine. I think you explained it well. I think there is a public policy goal we could set to reduce the number of ballot styles because it costs more and it obviously is more complicated. I'm wondering if this is a question perhaps more for the attorneys, will we require a charter amendment, or can we fix some of these things in the code? For example, if we wanted to say, the big ones get their own ballot style, perhaps. The ballot will look basically the same for most of Anchorage, and then we try to find some other way, whether it's online vote or a town hall, or whatever it be, where we can brainstorm. So the little LRSA election, those kind of things, are done through a different process than the traditional ballot. So I guess the question would be, would that require a charter amendment, and is there any thought about doing something like that going forward?
Mr. Falsey?
My sense is no, it wouldn't require a charter amendment. When the service areas are created, especially the road service areas, a lot of them say at the time that the voters approve it, either the board will be appointed or the board will be elected, but there's not a lot of specificity about the election. If you could get the LRSAs to agree to elect them at a general meeting or something, I think that would be kosher. And I actually think that some of the LRSA folks might like that because then they never have to touch APOC, they never have to do any of the public official filing rules. Some LRSAs may hate that, and we sort of floated the idea of why don't we just appoint all of you guys? But because some people like being public officials, like being elected. But if you could get the LRSAs out of the regular election, I think we will reduce the level of complexity radically, right? That would be good.
I would agree, and Mr. Falsey is correct. Was that one of your first things that you did as a municipal attorney? Went to that meeting with us at Jennifer Johnston and Bill Evans were the South Anchorage reps, and Mr. Falsey went, and we met with all of the LRSA reps. We bought pizza, and the presentation. We had a draft ordinance that they would. We said not be elected. I can't remember exactly. And it was overwhelmingly voted down. Overwhelmingly. And actually, Maury Robinson, who leads the Public Works Department and manages those, told us that he thought it would be positive. And it was just exactly the opposite. So what happened after that was we instead changed the code so that LRSA supervisors, boards of supervisors, are elected unless there's, and if there's a vacancy, they're appointed by the mayor. So one of the complications of the LRSAs was that every time there was a vacancy, we had to add that back into the ballot. So instead of having just the 28 LRSAs on an election, we would have 40 because there were so many vacancies. So we changed that part of the code, so now there's just 28 every year, and then the mayor appoints in the meantime. The second thing that we did is we required LRSA members to be a qualified write-in, and you got that complaint last year. That happened in 2016, but they weren't aware of it. It had an impact last year. And the benefit of that is in the past, because they don't have the APOC requirements or to avoid the APOC requirements, they would just file as a write-in or just say, hey, vote for me, and I'll vote for me, and then 2 votes would win that election. Well, the clerk's office didn't have any contact for that person. We had no phone number, no address, and a lot of times when we would call, and I think you've all heard this before, that the person said, oh, my neighbors did that as a joke. No, I'm not interested in running or serving. So we've solved that problem to some degree. And I think that Bill has a good idea asking them if they would be interested in serving at a general meeting. I think that is a possibility, and I would be willing to ask that.
Mr. Dunbar?
So I think, and I wasn't at that meeting, but I suspect that there were claims of a power grab by the mayor going to the 20% election. And I guess I would frame it as you're still elected, but now you can run your elections instead of us running your elections, something like that. Trying to think of a way that, whether it's at like a caucus, essentially, or at the community council in some way. I mean, the LURSs do exist and they do meet. And at least the LURSs, we only have one LURSA in our district, so I have a relatively limited experience with that, but they are like sort of coterminous with the Stuckingham Heights Community Council with Bachelor, and they are always there at the Bachelor Community Council. I don't know if that's the case with other LURSs, but trying to find a way we can sort of evolve the function out of the clerk's office and off of our ballots to their community meetings, I think would be a worthwhile cause.
That could see some savings. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you have a sense, Bill, because we deal with this sort of stuff in my other job all the time with data sets and maps not lining up, how many of those could be that sort of issue, and has anyone at the Muni looked into that, or Barbara, if you know the answer? Because it seems like it'd be nice to know the scale we're dealing with, too.
I don't know, but I suspect that there are a lot that are just GIS interpretations of an old bad map. Because when we went digging to find the real legal descriptions, and when we're creating service areas now, we're trying to be good about having real meets and bounds and actual legal descriptions. We did not find many. It seemed like the practice for many decades was this is the area that's on the map. So if that's true, then there are probably a lot that are just the first time somebody drew the park's boundaries and arc map, they drew it this way. When they drew the fire boundary, they drew it differently. And we can go reconcile it and say it was always supposed to be the same wherever it's supposed to be.
It seems I don't know what staff, GIS staff or how they work with different departments, but it seems like that would be a first step to just try to clean some of those up if we can get their help.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Wheeler might have a little bit of an idea of the scope of the problem as well from our elections perspective.
Well, from your perspective, the sticky notes capture the vast majority of the issues, right? Those are the ones that definitely need fixing. What was the count? Would you say it was 23?
23.
Yeah. So those are ones that became a problem for us in trying to reconcile addresses with the state. So it's not an overwhelming project, but with GIS, they need direction that they can make the change. They're not empowered to simply make that change. So that's why we need some force behind it to make it so. And ideally, it would be, if possible, done before the next election. So we're not setting up all these funky ballot styles for one-person districts, or nobody's there, but we have to produce the ballots anyway and be ready just in case.
So we actually don't really need a code change?
Well, we don't. I think what Bill said earlier, if I might say, is that maybe a lot of these can be fixed administratively, so to speak, but there may be some that require a legal description change, would be more problematic. The other potential is that, for whatever reason, the state's decision on what it thinks the precinct boundary is not consistent with our read of what the precinct boundary is. And this second page is an example where that issue could potentially come up. Where the state says the precinct boundary for 140 is the creek line, but the drawing is obviously below the creek line. So we had a dispute about whether that house is in 140 or 110. Ultimately, we have to go with the state's decision on that point, even if it may be incorrect as far as we're concerned. So in those situations, if we think the state has a misread, we have to approach the state on how to fix that. I don't expect a lot of movement there. And it may be the state won't do much of anything until they go through the census and start redrawing house boundaries and precincts associated with that, if and when that happens in the next couple of years after the census.
Mr. Trainee?
Barbara, to show how big the problem is, how many ballots do you have to produce for each precinct, each area?
Well, right now, we have 174 ballot styles. And for most precincts, like, the Big Blue, that's all of us that live in the Anchorage Bowl, it's a different ballot for each precinct.
Right.
Because we report up to precincts, so we have 122 precincts.
But
the
don't you
bigger
have to get like
problem-
Lursa's, Barbara? Order so many ballots for them?
Right.
How many?
The biggest, well, I ordered 40,000 ballots for this election. So, because we don't know if those people are going to vote. But down in our two problem precincts, it's 110 and 140, they have 8 ballot styles for those precincts.
Is there a minimum amount of ballots you have to order? You don't order just like 8 ballots. How many do you have to
You
get?
have to order like, well, it's probably closer to a couple hundred for each of those.
Just the cost.
Even if a voter, even if we
Crazy.
know there's one voter, you have a minimum number you have to order, but we tried to solve that problem with our Okidata printers that you bought. And we have an Okidata printer at each of the accessible vote centers. And then we have blank ballot stock. And so then we just print them now on the blank ballot stock if those voters come in. So that's one switch to vote by mail that saved us some money.
Thank you.
But if we're mailing those out, then we'd have to print them all and mail them all.
Well, fortunately, another beauty of vote by mail is you can have ballot 101, 102, 103, 104, and the printer picks ballot 1, ballot 2, 3, 4, and there's no extras. It's automated, and so that is another beauty of vote by mail. I don't have to order 50 of each for each precinct or polling location. So there's some beauty to that. But it is still problematic, and I appreciate some recommendations for a solution here. And I think we can get there, but we need your, as Forrest said, your approval, your encouragement, your authorization to go forward to address this potential public policy problem and address these issues.
Well, I think it makes perfect sense to me. Any members of the committee that would like to make a motion or anything?
Gina has a comment for you.
Mr. Gates?
I was just wondering if you think it could be an administrative fix. Is there maybe need for... Oh, sorry. Thanks. If you think there's an administrative way to fix it, is there a need for like assembly authorization to do that at the administrative level? Change these things? And I guess the second, would that have to change examples for I guess that's how the Federal Tax District at all? Or was the person that was giving data previously, that would get a different data in and be going for yourself, voting or that's the Tax District or yourself. What's the relationship there?
My answer to the first question would be no. To the ones we can fix administratively, we can just go fix. The answer to the second question is maybe. You can change taxes and which ballot style, but we know how to reconcile that because there is a touchstone which is the right answer, which is the original creation of the service area defines the boundary. So if the line is in the wrong place, it is wrong because it is drifted from what the original intent was. So moving someone into a tax district they didn't previously think they were in is putting the ship back in order. There was a mistake for us on trying to correct it. There's never going to be a time, I don't think, where we have a free choice of saying, where should this boundary be? Is this guy in or out? It's going to be, what was the original legal effect? Let's get back to the right starting point.
Mr. Gates?
Yeah, just a problem like 2-3 years ago, the teenage guys like 40,000 issues assistant municipal attorney signed for this project. We should probably get one involved.
What did you say? Do we have a system for what?
Do we have an assistant municipal attorney assigned to us?
Oh,
And the municipal attorney's office is absent from this meeting, so we should assign all of them.
yeah, let's assign someone. I
Mr.
think Becky, right? She's not doing anything.
Mr. Dunbar.
I think that issue that you raised, I mean, so if you were just
You're simply
moved
taking
from one
another
person
asset
to
from the
another,
municipal attorney's office and put it
hopefully
in
your
assembly.
taxes won't change.
Tell them to do it.
Maybe for some people, their taxes will go down slightly. But if someone is outside the RS zone,
That's how I got his
and is
position.
brought inside the RS through this process, doesn't that imply their taxes are going to increase significantly? And like a few of them, and you're right, it's the right answer, but I think we should brace ourselves for a handful of extremely angry people.
I think possibly.
Sounds like business as usual.
Possibly, but I think what we should do is task the clerk's office to tell us what are the 23 ones that we look at, and then we'll step through them, and if there's ones that look like they're particularly sporty, we can figure out what kind of photographs.
And we should start with the least controversial and work our way up from there. It seems to make sense for me. Ms. Jones?
I'm asking this question of Bill and Dennis because I don't know the answer. Does Chugiak Fire have tax? I know Anchorage Fire has tax. Does Chugiak Fire have tax? There's a tax.
There's a Chugach Fire Service area.
Chugach or Chugiak?
Chugiak.
Chugiak.
Chugiak. So is there a tax? Okay, and so that's one of our big problem areas. That is the beige colored map. That's the
Chugiak.
Chugiak fire. So there are lots of problems there. So that might go exactly to Dean and Forest issue. But there are some people who it might change. They might go from Anchorage fire to Chugiak fire, or from to no fire. So anyway, that's one of our potential issues.
I'm going to back around on that situation.
Okay.
All right, any further discussions about reconciling service area boundaries?
So, Mr. Chair, I presume that we are tasked for Dennis and Bill and I to go forward on this, and we'll include Dean as well, and we will be in touch with you and let you know how far we can get with this without the Assembly's, more input from the Assembly, and then we'll report back to you.
Well, I would recommend that you guys go ahead and do that. I don't see anyone on the committee shaking their head no, and we'll see what kind of progress you make. And you can give us a report at the next meeting or the one after that. Ms. Wemhoff?
Yeah, I just want to clarify what we're asking. We're asking them to go in, find more information, give us more information in case we do have to bring up an AO later on. But bottom line, you're looking for the information to see if something can be fixed easily by doing research, and if not, handle that later once you find out more information. That, I guess, what is it you three are doing? That's just my question.
Can I add something that I think we should authorize them to be able to make changes to small lines that don't impact any. I mean, if it's just an error and you move it over and they're just consistent. But if we want them to bring back everything, we could. I don't even know if it's our job to authorize. You can do it administratively. So do what you can do.
I don't know what you're tasking us to do, but I think what's going to happen is that we will get told the 23 problematic examples. We will look at the original Dead Sea Scrolls and see what the actual gospel says. We will see if that fixes the problem, or if there's some other action that we recommend the Assembly takes to help us fix it, because we don't want to stay true to the original word.
Okay. Well, that sounds good to me. Let's go on to new business item C, the North Carolina election investigation results. And I think Ms. Jones is going to talk to us about that.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I didn't bring a copy of the article, but I think some of you have probably read that North Carolina has ordered a new election. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. I have heard this sometimes called voter fraud, but I would like to suggest to you that this is probably more what I would call election fraud. And I think that there's a slight difference here. In this case, what happened is someone that was affiliated with the campaign was taking some actions to increase that candidate's, voter results. And so that's different.
like
I
no
want
good.
you to, we believe that that's different than a generalized allegation that vote by mail is more likely to be fraudulent. And this, North Carolina proves it because voters falsify signatures. So I want you to recognize, I believe that they're very different. This was a concerted effort by someone that was affiliated with a campaign. It was not voters who were out falsifying signatures. I think one of the other issues that we need to talk about and just raise in this issue is that the term ballot harvesting came up in this discussion. And so I have to admit, I've never heard of ballot harvesting before. I'm not positive I have a definition of ballot harvesting, but I know it's a person collecting ballots from a variety of people and depositing them. And it's a difficult issue if I bring my family's ballots that are mailed to us at our home here to the election center and drop them in a drop box. Is that ballot harvesting? I don't know the answer to that. So
I have my notes here. When you're ready,
Great.
I'll jump in. But
So the question that you want to think about is, and I talked to Dennis about this, and I did say, I don't know if ballot harvesting is illegal in Alaska or Anchorage. I do believe that that is one of the issues. It is illegal in North Carolina. So I think those are some of the issues, but I'll let Dennis follow up and explain.
And I believe actually California legalized it, so I believe it is legal to do it in California. But Mr. Trainee and then
Barbara,
Mr. Wheeler.
it almost sounds like you're talking about Muldoon and Gabrielle's last election. And that
Mr.
almost
Chairman,
seemed like ballot harvesting.
I was talking about North Carolina.
I know, but you're saying it hasn't happened here. But if you take a look at Muldoon with that one inside, the guy was bringing ballots in, absentee ballots, and then turning them in. And that almost seemed like ballot harvesting.
Interesting. Mr. Wheeler.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. So Mr. Chairman correctly noted that California recently enacted a law that allows ballot harvesting. Some jurisdictions are creating new laws to prohibit it, and this is part of the ongoing larger battle over things like voter identification and other changes in the law that tend to get politicized in terms of whether these sorts of new laws benefit Republicans or benefit Democrats. And so you're seeing this active legislative process going on in the various states, that either prohibiting certain things or adding new features. So, for example, California says you can go collect ballots for people. It's very good. It helps people who can't get back to a drop box or can't get to an election center to get those ballots turned in. North Carolina says you can't do it unless you are a near relative of the person, defined as brother, sister, spouse, grandparent, child, grandchild, mother-in-law, father-in-law, daughter-in-law, son-in-law, step-parent, or step-child. So those people can all collect ballots and bring them back for the family. But if you're not one of those, you need to be a legal guardian. If you're not one of those, then you're committing a felony if you collect your neighbors and do them a favor and take it to the drop box. Now it's a felony in North Carolina. So in this particular case, there are a number of other investigations and allegations going on in North Carolina related to this election, but the primary one was the clear felony of collecting the ballots. Whether you're paid to do it or do it as a favor or do it as a nonprofit, helping get out the vote, in North Carolina, you can't do it without committing a felony. So Barbara's point, that's an election law issue, not a voter fraud issue. There's in the context of that particular felony, there was no allegation that the voter didn't vote the ballot. It was just the method that the ballot was returned for counting. Now, there's some additional allegations that are being criminally investigated where one person says that they just gave their blank ballot to a collector, and then that collector may have voted the ballot, okay? That's a voter fraud issue. That's illegal here, as it is pretty much everywhere. Nobody can vote your ballot. You can't even do it through a power of attorney. You have to be able to vote your own ballot. So, Alaska and Anchorage, as far as I can tell, based on my read of the statutes and regulations, does not prohibit ballot collection on behalf of your neighbor, your friend, your relative. So, to the extent that that was a problem in North Carolina, it isn't at this point illegal in Alaska to do the same thing.
Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. We have the ordinance before us, not engaging in debate, just learning about this here. But to me, so what Mr. Train described that allegedly happened in Muldoon was more than just going around collecting ballots. You're talking about a person who was deceased, allegedly voted, right? You have a situation like what was just described about someone who is a blank ballots being collected. But quote-unquote harvesting, I mean, to me, it kind of has like a Frank Lutz ring to it where someone has created a scary-sounding word for something like souls to the polls, which used to be very common, It's a little bit different, obviously, because they're not taking the people, they're taking the ballot. But, we made a policy decision at this committee to not pay for postage. And so long as we're not paying for postage, I mean, I think regardless, I don't think I want to pursue an ordinance on this, down this road. But so long as we're not paying for postage, I think folks helping other folks deposit their ballots in the drop boxes to me sounds like reasonable public policy.
Mr. Wheeler.
Two more things I want to add. Number one, the Ninth Circuit is currently hearing an appeal on Arizona's 2016 law that bans ballot harvesting. Down there, family members can collect them, residents of the same household can collect them, caregivers, election officials, and postal officials can collect them. But there's a nonprofit that's challenging the law as to whether or not it's constitutional. And that's currently back in front of the Ninth Circuit, so we may get a federal level decision here next year on that. Number two, when you think about these issues, think about these examples that we've thrown out and how it might impact people. If, for example, you're a military overseas voter, who can return your ballot for you? If you're a special needs person, you're in the hospital and you need someone to come collect your ballot. Now, the municipal clerk's office provides a service where they'll send an election official. But it seems rather burdensome to have to make those arrangements if your friend who came to the hospital or your representative who signs up at the clerk's office, you can't bring that back for you on your behalf. So those are some things to be thinking about, those small but significant number of voters who need these specialized services.
Mr. Trainee.
I had at least 5 friends last year. They were over 90. They couldn't get down to drop the ballots off, so they called me. I picked them up and dropped them off.
Oh.
I'm just telling you, I dropped them off for them. And you know what? This election, if they want, well, there's only 4 around. 1 died. But they couldn't get around, so I picked it up for them, dropped them off. To me, that's not harvesting. That's just a public service you can do. It's not against the law here.
Ms. Wimhoff.
Harvesting, the harvesting is fine.
Excuse me. So I'm trying to think of the idea of bringing them to a drop box or putting them in a mailbox. And if I go to work, I mean, I don't have a work that I would go to that does this, but you go places and there's a mail bin for outgoing mail, and I drop it in there and someone else drops it in there, and that mail clerk picks up all the mail and takes it. Or I'm not taking it to the election center, I'm just taking it to a post office. I mean, how is that different of me just taking everyone's ballot to the mailbox for them?
In North Carolina, it would be illegal.
Okay, so mailbox or election box, it's the same thing.
Correct.
And whereas the mailbox, though, is not a clear, how it gets to the mailbox is interesting. Because there might be an apartment building or a business slot that you put it in, and then all the mail goes, and so someone else delivers the mail. It's not like you personally are taking it to the mailbox, or you personally are putting the flag up on your mailbox. Just a thought.
Interesting. All right. Well, we're past our 1 o'clock adjournment time, and so just wondering if we have any last-minute thoughts about the investigation results from the North Carolina ballot harvesting. Any additional comments on that? Any other old business that someone thinks about that we need to discuss that we haven't yet? Okay, I guess we're ready for audience participation.
Carl Haberman, I represent myself, I follow the public process. The public process is an appropriate decision made by the governing body and will like the public interest. Please hold the United States ballot. One, I would like to start on a positive note. I do appreciate the chair last few meetings.
Speak up, Eugene. I don't know if they can hear you.
Thank you. I appreciate the chairs trying to make the process better at these meetings, trying to ensure that public people are recognized before they speak. But we still have a problem with some here with the engagement with the free-for-all. But I do know the chair respectfully has substantially improved this situation where there's a better record of speaking at these meetings. Now, the key thing about it is the public needs to feel welcome. And the public needs to hear what you're saying. And you need to hear what you all are saying. But as long as you hold these meetings in this room with cacophony noise that has occurred in this room, and I've warned this body sometime not to meet here, we're going to have a huge problem of everyone hearing what people are saying. And almost everyone in this body here, except for about 2 or 3 people, are from outside and not part of this election center. So it makes it irrational for having the meetings here. And I noticed it's strikingly difficult for me as a member of the public to be questioned as where I can stand, yellow line, difficult to hear, and I knew would be problems with Dennis Wheeler as far as respectively able to hear what you're saying. You have a softer voice. Mr. Gates, it's more difficult for you to hear, and I respectfully would like to hear what you say, like everyone else. And as long as the situation is going to be, it's not a good situation. And if we're not going to hear from each other respectively, you need to cease, particularly hold these meetings here and put them in a better environment where the public can be here, you can be here in a way that we can hear from each other. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'm going to adjourn this meeting at about 1:10.